Perfect. I will start in 3, 2, 1, go. Good evening, dear House and dear judges. I'm your first speaker from the side proposition, and I will be arguing today why the African continental free trade area will do more good than it will do harm. Let me start with my status quo. The AFCFTA, established on the 21st of March 2018, is a free trade area encompassing most of the African countries. It eliminates the barriers to trade. It's supposed to be there to boost African trade. It's considered very effective, and this was it was signed on the January of 2021. We have a new system that is brought to Africa from Europe, resembling the European trading system, where we have no taxes, a free trading system between the countries. Now the question is if this is fitting. We have cultural differences in morals and beliefs. I do think, though, that it is fitting and will do Africa a lot of good. Let me start with my definitions. Let me start with my definitions. I've already given a partial definition of the AFCFTA. I want to add some things, though. There's certain policies, like there's no tax import, export fees, or VAT. These are being abolished or minimalized for 90% of the goods, and this is being done gradually, so there's no abrupt change. Good or harm is, we think, prioritizing the economy and the humanitarian aspect, the well-being of the individual. But also, of course, economy and politics. Let me split my case. I'm Luca, I'll be your first speaker. I'll go into some arguments, or one main argument being the economic benefits for every country in this group of countries. I think this is a major positive aspect. Natasha will be our second speaker, going into depth over the identity aspect as well as the cultural one. Baraka is the third speaker and will round off the case and will highlight the clashes and justify our win. Let me start with my arguments. As you know, they concern the economy. I think there will be major economic benefits for the African countries. By decreasing or even abolishing these taxes and fees, we encourage intra-African trade. So more traders will begin to manufacture, sell, import and export their goods in Africa. This will boost the wealth and the revenue of each individual company. And of course, the whole group of companies. The World Bank estimates that there will be an 81% growth in GDPs of these individual countries by 2035. This is, very, very high. We'll have a creation of another economic superpower. We'll restore the balance in the economic market around the world. We'll break up the current economic superpowers and this division of power, and will equalize the distribution of this power. Result is that we have less dependency on the West and East. We have individual development. African countries can now develop on their own, relying on each other, relying on their cultural values. Exactly, we have investors from other African countries investing in themselves, in their fellow country members, in their neighbors. We have a collective African development. Africa won't become a further playing ground of Western countries. This is also mentioned in the Agenda 2063 of the African Union, where Goal 8 is a unified Africa, and we feel like this aspect of the AFCFTA goes into that direction. Also, it states that it wants to get rid of the dependency of other countries and investors that come from a foreign country, and that keep Africa alive and keeps it developing. African people will now turn to themselves for help and support. They're bound by trade, development, and now success. They will turn to the outside as a powerful group and as a powerful group of countries by showing others that Africa now matters again. They can now emphasize their problems in a global scale. They can talk to other powerful leaders and address their problems. Their goals will become the world's goals. Yes, okay, I will rest my case. I think to summarize everything, the economic aspect is major and yeah, is a major benefit for this African group.
3, 2, 1. Okay, so we feel like this debate is about one key thing. In status quo, there's a problem-solution gap in which African economies are stuck in a state of stagnation. Our second speaker is going to come and talk to you more about this, but one main point that we're going to make is that regional trade blocs are already going to provide us with the same benefits that the proposition is talking about. In the first speech, they give us a list of claims of all these things that are going to happen under their side of the world. Without addressing the fact that there's little to no mechanization or links given in their speech, it's just a list of claims. We're already going to prove to you in our case that this is something that's going to happen on our side, along with the other points and mechanization that I'm going to give you in mind. Okay, so firstly, before I get into that, some key points of characterization. One key point that the proposition didn't touch on, and that's on characterizing what African nations look like, what do they need, what benefits them most. The first thing that we need to consider is that African industries are very fragile. Because of colonization, Africa kind of had a late start in developing the industries, developing the businesses. But within the context of the African continent, some countries have had more time to prepare than others. You know, like South Sudan has had less time to prepare than South Africa because of how they got their independence. So it's going to be uneven, and I'm going to get into that in my second point. But one main point that has gone off. So because these industries are fragile and because it's like this, it's very important for these African countries to implement protectionist policies, to focus on growing their own businesses from within, growing their own industries from within, and then we'll be able to develop the way the African countries need to develop in order to be independent and free from help from the rest of the world. Okay, so now to my substantive argument, and what I was touching on in my characterization, is that African free trade areas increase competition. One thing that is a harm with increased competition that's going to come with this, you know, countries are going to have to compete with other nations, is that it's harder for local businesses to compete. Why is this? Because now if you're looking at it in the context of an international nation, like I gave the example of South Africa. South Africa has had more time to develop its industries, it's had more time to just generally provide better goods. At a point where you says, okay, there's no tax from goods that come from South Africa, I'll take your point later. At a point where there's no taxes from goods that come from South Africa, individuals in Kenya are able to get that at a same or even lower price than goods that come from Kenya. And why is this important? It's important because then demand will decrease for local goods, which means that there'll be less revenue for local businesses. Why is this harmful? It's harmful because in the context, if you're actually trying to make these countries independent, to make Africa independent, then you actually need to build these businesses that are local. If you're looking at countries that don't have as developed or as established industries and you're actually outsourcing this to other countries, what's going to happen is that there's less demand for the local ones, and then it's going to harm that country in the sense that they can't develop that. But why is all of this important in this debate? Because of two main impacts. The first is on the micro level, in the context of economies with fragile industries, as we've talked about before. Yes. So I've talked about how the higher quality products for consumers and how it gives them less demand. The drop in demand means that now in a country like Kenya, where let's say it makes inferior coffee to Ethiopia, then we're looking at the fact that Kenyan coffee makers primarily that depend on local.
POI?
Yes, I'll take your POI.
Why would you disregard that other countries also do have other resources, and that means that there will be a better way of allocating each other's resources?
Okay, so because other countries have the resources, the point that I'm making is because other countries have other resources, if I'm making them more readily available to locals, then demand is going to drop for local goods. And when demand drops for local goods because people are now buying international things because they're cheaper, then it's going to be harder for those local businesses to survive. And why I'm telling you it's important on the micro level is because at a point where businesses are hard to run, then it's going to be harder for the common person to start a business. It's going to be harder for common people to make money. Generally in the economy, it's going to be harder to make a living because you have to compete not only with local people, but with international trade in the context of the African continent. And on the second macro impact is that when there's less money circulated in the economy, due to the fact that these businesses generally will thrive less, you have a worse GDP, you have worse development as a country individually, because at a point where your businesses aren't growing, at a point where there's no demand for your own goods, then there's a lower GDP. So all the points that the first proposition gave us with no mechanization, with no justification, don't stand under this point, because if local businesses begin to fail, then you don't have any growth if it comes to, if you want your own country to grow, you need to protect its businesses, you need to build on its businesses, build its industries, so then only then will there be money in the economy, will you be able to grow your economy. With that said, I rest my case, proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. That would like to invite a second speaker.
Texting? Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. My name is Natasha Shituvi, and I'm the second speaker on the proposing side. I will first start by rebutting some of the stuff that have been said by the opposition speaker. First, that there's fragility in African companies. That will not be the case when it comes to the African trade area, because that means that they will have more economic support, as well as reducing some of the costs, which we know is the current economic system. You have to do maximization of profit. And that would happen if everyone was unified and they got lower taxes. That would mean a decrease in one part of the budget that they have and an increase on the other part that they have to supply their suppliers with. You also said that would promote competition in African countries. Of course it would. That's the whole point of our system, our economic system, is innovation. You make your things better because you know the other countries would do that. And that would only happen intra-African, also intra-continental-wise. That would not mean that we have competition within ourselves. It means we better each other so that the other continents see that we are the best ones. You also said that that would remove demand for local goods. That's not true. That would make local goods cheaper than foreign goods. Foreign goods are the only ones that get paid taxes on. You may state your point.
Okay, then if you're going to state that local goods, businesses will have to make local goods cheaper, wouldn't you argue then it's harder to run a business? If you're being forced to make your goods cheaper, wouldn't you be able to survive?
That's what you're getting wrong. Because the African trade area does not mean that you make your goods cheaper. It means that you make more profit. You do not have to reduce the prices of your goods. You just have to reduce how much you're paying to export. That's the difference. I will now be moving into one of the reasons why the African trade area will do more good than harm. First of all, it creates a national identity. Due to colonization, African countries focus on themselves as single and sovereign states happening without each other. And we know that's one of the biggest misconceptions that we have. The ancestors of the African continent fought for a better Africa. Some of the most prominent freedom fighters did believe in an Africa together, an Africa for good together. That would also mean that there would be an economic superpower, seeing as Vision 2030 in Kenya is something that we are all striving for, and Vision 2063 for the whole of Africa. That would probably lead into the no visas. That makes it better for Africa because intellectuals would have access to each other, definitely making an expertise, and that would be better for intellectuals, and that would lead to innovation in Africa, which would then level the playing field with other continents because the products are as good as theirs. African independence is one of the biggest contested things in the world. To quote Dambisa Moyo, an economist, a Zimbabwean economist, who actually did strive for an Africa together, that means that we account for each other. African countries cannot work alone. That is why it's more sustainable than different countries working on their own capitalistic states. An Africa that's fought together means it's more sustainable. That means low taxes, no import taxes, and a wider market, because the other continents see that they will get a maximization of profit if they do sell within the African continent. That leads into industrialization of very many African countries, new technologies, and new developments to be made. if we have new developments, we level the playing field. Africa becomes an economic superpower. More investment in African products creates an African pride that we have not had for years due to imperialism and white savior mentality. The GDP would increase by 81%, and what does an increment of GDP do? A reduction of poverty, which means a reduction in global poverty, as Africa has the largest population continental-wise. That means reducing the poverty line and creating one of the GDPs that are more contested on the African continent. This also leads into reduction of stereotypes that Africa has been seen as one of the poorest levels. And we do know that if we do create independence of their economic structure, that means that we will be given fairer trade deals by other continents and not only on the continent itself. We can look at one of the biggest economic successes if we talk about Libya, not now, but the Libya that was before. Muammar al-Gaddafi did believe in an Africa together and an Africa for future, which would have then reduced all the poverty lines, but of course the Western side was afraid of competition, and that is why the free trade area in Africa is one of the biggest things that would elevate us to a higher level. People would see us as intellectuals, and Africa would be back as a playing factor. That is my case.
So I'm Kausar Khanna. My pronouns are she, her. I'll be the second non-affirmative speaker. Panel, problem solution gap. African countries are developing in nature. That means they suffer from economic stagnation, which essentially means they suffer from poverty. Even if they have skilled and unskilled labor, and that is cheap labor, we still think they are lower job opportunities, right? Also, we need to understand there's a very high dependency on the kind of revenues we do get from any kind of import-export businesses that we as the African nations do, right? The strategic value of that context leads me to two responses for the proposition, right? Firstly, they come and make an assertion that, look, at a point where you have a free trade agreement, right, you're going to have self-sustainability of Africa in of itself, and you're going to have new developments in terms of technology and innovation. Understand that most of the countries in the African continent are agrarian in nature. That essentially means that if Egypt, Chile, Sudan, and Kenya are all exporting maize, where exactly are you getting any kind of innovation? Understand that the most profitable market for these African nations when it comes down to trading is the agrarian market. There's nothing else. And even if there is a secondary factor where they can try and become innovative, Jerry's point still stands, because then you do not only introduce competition at a domestic level, but it becomes international. That is why he tells you strategically in his POI that at a point where you introduce 3 other actors to compete with a domestic market, because this domestic market needs to become competitive, it will lower its production cost. That essentially makes these imports, or rather these exports, become much more cheaper, right? You need to still tell us then at what point does the African nation in itself still benefit, right? But even secondly, the idea of, or rather a harms analysis, which will tackle the second idea that, look, we are going to better each other, and the idea of a narrative that African nations need to work together to compete against the other continents. Look, number one, we're in an actors motion. All actors are going to be selfish. You cannot tell me when it comes down to Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, Madagascar, all these people have a same power dynamic. You need to concede to the fact that South Africa, Madagascar have a higher GDP than Kenya and Tanzania have, and because that exists in status quo, what are you going to do about the power dynamic or the idea of lower bargaining power, right? But let me move on to the harms analysis. The 3 points here. Firstly, we think, like I said, because we depend solely on the agrarian nature of the market in African continent, we're going to have a glut in the market, which essentially means we'll be exporting, importing the same products, and that kind of competition will be on maybe 2 or 3 shillings, right? But we don't necessarily get any kind of better mechanization or impact that even when you're trading these similar products, why is it, number one, beneficial for the main actors in this debate, but even secondly, why then these types of goods are going to become more efficient or profitable for the producers and the manufacturers, right? But even thirdly, they do not mechanize to us when, even if any kind of specialization does come in, how exactly are you going to compete with the other continents when you're used to competing just inside the African continent? No mechanization whatsoever, right? But the second harms analysis here is the idea of the power dynamics. We already have in status quo regional trade blocs. The reason why those are so important in this debate is that you do get the benefit of a kind of trading agreement in your own demographic. But even secondly, it strips away the idea of that lower bargaining power. That means those people in the north versus the west, those people have the higher GDPs, so they deal with the trading themselves compared to people in the south, right? The reason why then these regional trade blocs are going to be a much more better alternative of something we do prefer instead of having a free trade area is the idea that, look, you're going to have the same bargaining power. Number two, the idea of tariffs or the idea of getting revenue is still something relevant you get through these regional trade blocs, right? But before I move on, I'll take a POI. Shoot. All right, sorry, my time's up. Just moving on to the second point of harms, right? You need to understand that when you're doing a harms motion, you still need to prove to us that even if you're trying to go against status quo, prove to us why then it's going to be so much more beneficial for us to go into a free trade agreement when we already have regional blocs, right? But even secondly, you need to prove to us why the main actors in this debate, the African nations, will actually get much more benefits, right? So what do I give you in summary from our side of the house? We talk about the idea of self-sustainability already existing in status quo because we do have these regional trade blocs. We think innovation can work, it's sort of symmetrical on both sides. We just think because we have trade blocs that can work even better because we're still getting a stream of revenue, right? But on your side of the house, you still need to deal with the harms of economic stagnation in African countries, the idea of a lack of, or rather, the presence of a power dynamics. But even thirdly, the idea that domestic markets will end up suffering just because you want an external benefit. I rest my case. Thank you.
I'm starting in 3, 2, 1. My name is Baraka Okumu, and I am the third speaker of side proposition of the current motion that we are debating. Let's go back a little bit. For us to understand the African continental free trade area, we must understand on which foundation it is laid upon, which is Agenda 2063 of the African Union, which majority of the countries in Africa are signatory and cognizant of. This free trade is then established on the values of integration of the African people, freedom in Africa, especially economically, and reducing dependency of foreign trade and foreign aid, and creating a system of where Africans are able to live and depend on each other. However, opposition then fails to see the major economic benefits that the African continental free trade area then bring, as it then levels the playing field with the different areas of competition. They have painted competition with such terrible colors. Competition is here then to then set a standard, a proper standard of all African products coming in and out of the continent, to then boost and then make them even better for the consumers outside of Africa, so we can even say that this can be used as a testing phase, meaning that we get to benefit from it all. It then brings a voice to Africa, a voice that has been taken away from us for many years, for countless of years. We've been told on how to run our economy, run our states. So let me ask opposition, what is the problem when we take our own power? It gives us a shared identity. It gives us a voice of our own. We do not need, yes, I'll take the POI.
Don't you agree then if our country were to set a competition standard that's too high for another country to follow, wouldn't that country that can't keep up to the standard just fail in its economy?
I'll be getting to that soon in my topic of, in the area of codependency. It then brings us a voice, it brings us to the table, to the national table. For the first time in hundreds of years, Africa will be listened to. Why? Because we will be an economic superpower through the African continental free trade. Codependency is then established between the different African nations to help each other rise against everyone who is then opposing this African free trade continental area because of the benefit it it brings. Through that, we create then capital to give to these businesses in these countries so they too can thrive. We then do not need to go to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to borrow money to build, but we can rely on our own people who we can trust, who we have an amazing social contract with, and who share our values. In that, through the African continental area, we're also driving out imported goods by supplying the African demand with African goods, then improving the livelihoods of Africans, meaning that there will be no poverty. What does poverty lead to, I might ask? Crime. Why crime? Crime because people will no longer need to be smuggling goods in and out of borders because they cannot afford to pay the tax, they cannot afford to pay the duty, they cannot afford to pay the value-added tax. And then I ask myself, why then would you oppose something that would bring so much economic power with, I'd rather say, petty arguments? I rest my case.
Thank you for that speech. We now move into the third speaker from opposition here.
My name is Joy Magomba. I'll flag for POIs, and before I begin, I would like to say the organizers have done a great job and we've had a great debate. So, yeah. I'll start my speech in, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I think when we're analyzing this motion, it's more about the trade-off between whether we're having greater economic benefits and whether we're having people who are losing outright, who are losing. So if we look at their side of the world, there's kind of this idea that we're able to get an increase in GDP, better competition, and other benefits which I'll get onto when I address the clashes. But also on our side of the world, we see some other economic benefits as well as potential harms that arise from their side of the house. I think the debate comes in when we look at which side is better able to mitigate people who are losing outright, because the aim of this debate is to have these African countries and this African continent be as economically successful as possible, and we want to limit the amount of people who lose out, and it's this idea of trade-off. And I think in that sense, side opposition wins in a favorable manner. So onto the main clashes as I identify them in this debate, right? Firstly is on the idea of protectionism versus free trade, and then secondly on the idea of whether or not the economy will grow and whether or not the economy will prosper. On the idea of protectionism or free trade, we see two main ideas from side proposition. One, because of this free trade, domestic goods eventually become cheaper. I'll prove why that's flawed and why that's economically wrong. But even secondly, how we're able to have less dependency of the West, and how when there are no tariffs and tariffs are removed gradually, we're able to experience this sort of magnitude of economic benefits and greater development, and all of this benefits from inter-African trade. Why these arguments are fundamentally flawed? Firstly, if we look at the idea of every country on the continent removing trade barriers such as tariffs, that's a significant loss in tax revenue, right? Because we think about all this revenue that's gained from tariffs, we think it's extremely important, especially when we characterized what African countries look like and their goals from our first speech. We think the loss of these tariffs are extremely important, and they don't address this on any side of their house. What we tell you on side opposition, one, a lot more people are going to lose out than they do win, and we tell you these people look like the local workers, the domestic producers, people who are not able to compete with these sort of outside firms and these outsourced people. And the nature of African businesses, as we've told you, are mostly agricultural. Because of this and because of the lack of way to sort of combat this and way to compete, we see a significant rise in the price of imports in the price of exports as opposed to imports. Why this is significantly harmful? People will choose exported goods. You as a consumer will choose to buy a South African produced bread, for example, as opposed to your baked bread from Kenya, because it's significantly cheaper. This means that your domestic industries are harmed, and we've proven to you why this, in the end, will not lead to kind of this economic benefit and the GDP growing, as we've mentioned. But even if we ignore all of that, right, in status quo, we've told you that there are already regional blocks existing. The idea of competition, the idea of innovation, all of these benefits that they give you exist on our side of the world. What we give you exclusively, one, is the ability to gain these revenue and the tax revenue, as I've told you. But even secondly, we've proven to you why there are kind of discrepancies in the sort of influence these countries have. For instance, Nigeria, if they come in and tell you the way they've told us that Africa will now become a superpower because of this 81% increase in GDP, this 81% increase in GDP will not be experienced by all countries equally. We look at Nigeria, they already have somewhat of the infrastructure. South Africa, they'll experience a boost. But we compare with a country like Madagascar, right? We're not seeing this sort of equal and African benefit and everyone benefiting as side proposition I've tried to paint. On to the second clash before my time runs out, which is on the issue of the growth of the economy. They tell you that better competition will lead to greater innovation and increase in the GDP. We've proved to you why we have that on our side of the house as well, because of these regional trade blocks existing in status quo. Let's ignore all of that. Why is this argument flawed? Firstly, competition won't directly and inherently lead to innovation in Africa. We look at this in the sense that not every country has equal access to capital, to resources, to be able to innovate and kind of place themselves in a better place to be competitive in the market. This looks like people gaining more than others, and this sort of trade-off between where we have greater losers on their side of the house than we do on our side of the house. And even secondly, the issue of dependency in Africa and becoming a superpower, as I've explained, would not be necessarily the case. Because of this, we are proud to oppose, and we rest our case. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. We now move into the final segment of the debate, where 3-minute reply speeches will be delivered by the debaters. With that being said, opposition reply speaker.
Panel, this debate comes down to the idea that proposition do not fulfill their burden, because we come to you and tell you there's no problem with having free trade. We think it's essentially something good, but then they do not give us exclusive benefits on why this free trade area is so necessary that we need to break down regional trade blocks like ECOWAS and SADC, right? They do not engage with the context that we tell you that even when you have free trade, because you've got regional blocks existing, you do get the benefits, but also you're able to mitigate the kind of harms. We fulfill a burden because we're able to point out to you key harms that we do not necessarily find sufficient responses, right? Firstly, we tell you, because Africa in of itself is based on an agrarian economy, we do not see the kind of innovation or the kind of new sustainability that they end up talking about. Because even if we're only able to trade maize and beans and agrarian products, we still will be behind in terms of technology, in terms of the manufacturing industry. So we do not get any kind of response to show us that, look, even if South Africa is just doing agrarian, we can still be able to, become more technologically innovative. No responses whatsoever, right? But we point out 3 main harms in this debate, something that sort of takes down their case from the first speech. Firstly, we prove to you that it's going to be harmful to the domestic economy. From our first speech, we tell you the idea of removing any kind of import tariffs or the idea of removing any kinds of barriers to trade would essentially make the products in the domestic economy much more cheaper. The reason here is basic economics, so I'm not going to get into that. But then the second harm here is that the idea of dumping goods into other countries, right? I talked to you about the power dynamics that would exist in African continental free trade agreement, right? Because South Africa and Madagascar cannot be compared to Kenya and Uganda. That essentially means they have better bargaining power. Because they have better bargaining power and better GDPs, they would end up benefiting, but other actors such as Uganda, Kenya would still be in their very low GDP. So their metric of let's help Africa and let's take our power will not work, right? But even thirdly, we we think because domestic producers need to make their products much more cheaper, you end up losing out. So notice here, you're making your products much more cheaper. You're already losing out on a lot of profit. But even secondly, because of lack of any kind of tax or any kind of revenue to the government, you essentially end up making a loss. Comparatively, when we have regional trade blocs that do have a principle of free trade, but also have the kind of customs that are going to be put in at a point where you're able to trade with other members outside the regional trade bloc, we think that is a much better alternative. So in summary, they still do not answer the question as to why there's an urgent need to actually go into a free trade agreement and have Africa as a continent trade together when we already have existing regional blocs. But even secondly, they did not respond to the harms that the domestic economy and African as a country or as a continent is the most important actor, and how then will they benefit them better? Proud to oppose.
I'll be starting in 1, 2, 3. First, I will be summarizing up the points that have been brought up by the opposition side, which has been fragility, competition, as well as regional trade blocs and greater economic benefit that shall not be reached. All of that sounds like colonialist talk, and we know that is true. Trading blocs are something that have been brought by the colonialist side. But free area trades have also worked in Europe, as we see. The EU is one of the biggest economic powers, and they have definitely defeated our regional trade blocs. For example, East African Community. It is a regional trade bloc. We are still some of the poorest country in the world. How has that helped us? How have any of the regional trade blocs helped us better than the African, on a wider scale? Competition in Africa is one of the biggest things that happen. We are in a capitalistic market. That is nothing that we can oppose, and that means innovation. That also means profit maximization, which happens by removing export taxes and import taxes, and that doesn't mean that your product becomes cheaper, which they keep mentioning. I don't know why. Your product does not become cheaper. You actually get more profit because you get to concentrate the funds that you have taken away into innovation. They also mentioned that you would buy export goods because they're cheaper, which is not true, because we do live in that status quo. We do live in that reality. No one buys European products because they are more expensive, because they do pay taxes. You pay taxes, you get profit maximization, which is one of the biggest points of our capitalistic mindset. I will also go into how we told them about the African identity. The African identity is completely sidelined by their side. Even though we are talking about economic resources, that is very true, and that has been actually proved by very many international organizations. There will be an 81% increase of profit as well as economic resources. But they definitely sideline the African identity. That is what very many African leaders have been asking for. It has never been contested for. So many economists do say that there is a need for independence in Africa as a whole and not in parts. When you divide them into regional trade blocs, you remove this shared identity that our ancestors have been fighting for years. This is all part of the colonialist mindset, which says divide and conquer, and that's what they have done. We do live in that status quo, and that is something that they have proved very many times again. East African Community, as I have said before, we are still some of the poorest countries in the world. So many economists, African economists, have definitely said that once we band together and release ourselves from the shackle of the Western powers, that is when we will get innovation, and that is when we will give our own identity, which they have wanted. They've also been talking about outsourcing, but outsourcing does mean that you get cheaper goods from other places. That's not what would be happening. It's intercontinental. You get to have the same prices and the same quality, and that is my case.
Thank you so much for an amazing debate. We're all impressed. The audience is impressed. The panelists are all impressed, happy, and yeah, it was amazing. For that being said, I'd like to ask the debaters to cross the floor and shake hands as we depart and go deliberate, and we shall come and announce the winner later on.